Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the Pharma R&D Review webinar for 2019. Hello from London. Let's start by introducing today's presenters. My name is Ian Lloyd. I'm the Senior Director for Pharmaprojects, and my co-presenter is...
Hi, I'm Alex Shimmings, and I'm the Executive Editor for Scrip.
So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We just wanted to let you know that both the slides and a recording of the webinar will be available for everyone after the presentation finishes. And also you can enter questions that you have for us during the webinar using the chat facility. We'll try and answer some questions towards the end of the presentation, but if we don't, we will definitely make sure we get back to you within the next few days with the answers to your questions. So today's webinar is called What Changed in 2018 and What to Look Out For in 2019. It's based on the Pharma R&D report, which I've been authoring all the way back since 1993, looking at trends in pharma R&D. And in the last few years, we've also been following it up with a supplement looking at the new active substance, so new drug launches in the previous year. As the report's been running for many years now, to try and make it a little bit more interesting, during the last few years we've tried to add themes to draw parallels to pharma R&D. Last year was pop music, which I know was pretty popular, and this year we went with sporting images, which is why you can see some images of sports people on the main slide there. So we thought that sport was a particularly apposite allegory for drug development, because drug development is not only a race, but you also need speed, you need stamina and strength, and something that will become increasingly important, agility. So let's look at our agenda for today. We'll be starting off by looking at the total pipeline size, so the total number of drugs in R&D as of 2019. Then we'll be moving away from the current pipeline, and I'll hand over to Alex for a review of the success stories of 2018. So the new active substance drug launches, and we'll be looking at the most interesting and innovative new drugs. Then we'll be coming back to me for a further review of the pipeline as it stands now. And we'll be slicing and dicing the pipeline by a number of different measures, looking at the top companies, the leading therapies, the leading diseases, trends in mechanisms and targets, and also breaking the pipeline down by the biotech versus pharma. Then towards the end of the presentation, I'll switch back to Alex, who'll be looking at the outlook for pharma in the year ahead, looking at launches expected from the 2018 late drug approvals, looking at drug approvals we expect to occur during 2019, and some of the macro issues likely to affect the industry. So let's start off with the total drug pipeline in 2019. And just before we start, every time we talk about the pipeline, what we're talking about here is information gained from our Pharmaprojects database, which covers all drugs in commercial development from the early preclinical stages through the stages of clinical trials, through the pre-registration and registration phases, and it also includes a number of launch drugs, but to be considered still in the pipeline, they must still be in development for additional diseases or additional countries. And here we have our headline figure for 2019. So this gives you the total number of drugs in the pipeline all the way back to the start of the millennium. So you can see for around 6,000 in 2001, we're now up to a figure of 16,181. Very significant growth over the past 20 years or so. The growth rate for 2018 to 2019 was 6.0%. And if we look at the growth rates over the past 3 years, we've seen rises of 8.41%, 2.66%, and 5.99%, which averages out at 5.69%. So it makes the 2019 growth rate slightly above the 3-year mean. But as I just mentioned, most of the drugs we're talking about here are pre-launch. So these are effectively costs to the industry. So having more drugs in the pipeline isn't necessarily a good thing. And it depends really on the fact that the pipeline is actually producing new drugs. So before we go into the pipeline in more detail, I'm going to hand over to Alex now, and she's going to tell you how the industry performed in outputting new drugs for 2018.
Thank you, Ian. So in this section, we're going to have a look at the new active substance drug launches. And before I start, I should clarify exactly what a new active substance is. We define a new active substance, or NAS, as a novel chemical or biological entity where the active ingredient has received no prior approval for human use. So it includes vaccines with a novel antigenic component, but it excludes novel formulations, generics and biosimilars. And we think this provides a more robust indicator of industry R&D performance. So looking at this slide, we can see that 2018 was the best year on record for new active substance launches. And when we say record, we're going back to 2000 here. At the left of the graph, you can see the figures for 2000 going all the way through to 2018. These show the number of new active substances, and we've split out vaccines at the top in grey. So what you can see here is what looks like a clear trend going up over the last 5 years or so. We can see that last year's tally was 68, and that beats the previous record of 63, which was back in 2014. But we like to look at the 5-year means because we think this gives a sort of more nuanced kind of approach to how well we're doing, and we can see that this trend does seem to be holding steady. The 5-year means for 2014 to 2018 was 54.4. And that was well ahead of the mean for 2009 to 2013, which was 41. And that itself was a lot more than the 2004 to 2008, which was 28.6. So it does look like a genuine upswing. So in the next few slides, we're going to take a look at how those new active substances, the new active substances that stood out, and that was mainly by being first-in-class therapies. 2018 produced 15 novel NASs, and that was up from 14 in 2017. But 2 of these products actually contain 2 novel mechanisms of action, so the actual total tally was a little bit higher. Overall, there were 4 anti-cancers, 4 in alimentary and metabolic, and 2 each for the anti-infectives, ophthalmologicals, and blood and clotting products. And then there was 1 novel neurological MOA. So here we're going to look at the novel new drug approvals and launches, and this is part 1, where we're going to look at cancer. The first of these was Biotech. This is a TRK tyrosine kinase inhibitor for tumours with the neurotrophic receptor tyrosine kinase gene fusion, or NTRK. So this was the first of the so-called tumour-agnostic therapies to be approved. It received approval under accelerated approval under the accelerated pathway in the US, but its indication was not for use in a particular tumour type like breast or lung, but for solid tumours with certain abnormal NTRK genes. Its originator, LOX, though, has now been bought by Eli Lilly, although this particular product was licensed to Bayer, and Bayer has managed to lock in the full rights for Biotech. But one thing about this, while it was hailed as a milestone for precision medicine, there are only about 2,500 to 3,000 newly diagnosed cases of this particular type of cancer in the US each year. And one problem is actually going to be finding those patients, because it's not easy under the usual cancer screening practices. So that means that peak sales are not particularly high. Bayer has already guided that it thinks peak sales should reach 750 million euros. Which is not exactly multi-blockbuster. It also has a rival coming up in the form of Roche's entrectinib. That's currently waiting approval in the US and the EU. And Roche is hoping that it's developing a companion diagnostic, which it hopes will help identify the rare patients and help it when it comes onto the market, because obviously it's coming to the market second. The next one is Tibsovo, and this is the first isocitrate dehydrogenase 1, or IDH1 inhibitor, and that's from Agios. Agios launched an IDH2 inhibitor called Adhefa last year, again for acute myelogenous leukemia. And together they're forming part of a new wave of treatments for AML, which are transforming prospects for these patients. Next we have Copictra, and that's from Veristem. This is the first dual inhibitor of PI3K delta and gamma to hit the market, and this places it in competition with Gilead's PI3K inhibitor Zydelig and AbbVie's BCL2 inhibitor Venclexta in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Virstem is actually priced at a slight premium, and the drug does have a black box warning though for serious toxicities, which do seem to be a bit of an issue with the PI3K class. And then finally on this slide we have Yvica. This is a little bit of an unusual product. It's actually an immuno-oncology agent, and it was first launched in Cambodia by the Chinese company Yicheng Biopharma. It's different. It puts together an inactivated purified rabies virus with the firm's proprietary RNA-based toll-like receptor 3 agonist adjuvant technology, which is called PICA. So it's a novel immunological cancer therapy, and it's for the treatment of advanced solid tumours, including lung, breast, liver, and colorectal. In this page, we've got the second part of our new active approvals, and we're looking at alimentary and metabolic. So the first here is Crysvita, and that's for the rare disease X-linked hyperphosphatemia, and that was approved for use in both adult and pediatric patients. And it's also now been approved in the EU. It appears to be the only product in the Pharmaprojects database with this particular mechanism of action, and that's inhibiting fibroblast growth factor 23. Now, this is a rare disease again. It's a sort of inherited form of rickets, and this is estimated to affect about 12,000 patients in the US. Next, we have Ajinomoto, Mochida, and EA Pharma's Goofice, and that's for chronic constipation. Again, this product has a dual mechanism of action. It's an ileal bile acid transport inhibitor and a sodium bile acid co-transporter inhibitor. And neither of those activities have previously been found in a marketed drug before. This is different because it's one of the 8 molecules that debuted in Japan last year, and it was developed there by Albero Pharma, which was a spin-out from AstraZeneca. The last 2 products on this slide are both enzyme replacement therapies, and this is a common source of new novel active substances over the past few years. The first one is Lamzid, and that's from Chiesi for alpha-mannosidosis. And the second is Biomarin's Palynziq, which is an enzyme replacement therapy for phenylalanine for phenylketonuria. And that's another rare population of only about 11,000 patients in the US. Next, we're going to move on to novel mechanisms that we found in the anti-infectives area. So the first of these is Trogarzo from Therapeutic. This is an interesting new treatment for HIV patients, and it's for those who are failing standard heart therapy. It's the first of the new class of drugs which inhibit the CD4 and GP120 envelope interaction, and that works to inhibit viral entry into the cells. It's unusual, again, for an HIV therapy in that it's a monoclonal antibody and therefore injected. And as I said, it's going to be used as a rescue therapy for patients who are experiencing treatment failure. And that was approved in the EU, in the US. The second of these is Shionogi's Xofluza, and this is a novel treatment for flu. It's a new direct antiviral therapy. And so it's branching the field out away from the older neuraminidase inhibitors. So Xofluza inhibits the cap-dependent endonuclease, and is the first endonuclease inhibitor to be successfully developed. This one debuted in Japan. It's another of the Japanese debuts, but it's just been filed in the US by Roche. Moving on to ophthalmology. Ophthalmology actually had a really notable year in 2018 with the launch of the first in vivo gene therapy to be approved by the FDA, and that was Spark's Luxturna. This is for patients with a genetic disease, obviously. It's the biallelic RPE65 mutation-associated retinal dystrophy. And it's been launched at a high price tag of $850,000, but not as high as some, it could have been. The product was licensed to Novartis outside the US, and now Spark is busy being acquired by Roche. Roche is going to pay about $4.8 billion for the company. Not only does it want to get hold of Luxturna within the States, but also it's keen on Spark's gene therapy candidates for haemophilia, which is a really active area for gene therapy. And finally, in ophthalmology, we've got a slightly less glamorous but still very welcome new treatment avenue for glaucoma, which is a much more common disease, and this is Aries Rhopressa. Rhopressa is a Rho-associated kinase 2 inhibitor. It was launched in the US last April, and we're expecting an approval decision in the EU in the second half for that product. Now we're moving on to blood and clotting disorders, and we had two novel launches for different forms of thrombocytopenic purpura, and those are the thrombotic and idiopathic forms. The first of these is Cablevy, and this was the first therapeutic approved for this disease. It's originated with Ablinx, which has since been bought by Sanofi. Now, Cablevy is a bivalent nanobody, and it blocks the interaction of the ultra-large von Willebrand factor monomers with platelets, and therefore has an immediate effect on platelet adhesion. Nanobodies themselves, they're the smallest fragment of the naturally occurring single-domain antibodies, which are fully functional, and because they're so much smaller than traditional monoclonals, they can penetrate the target tissues much more effectively. So that's a little bit different there. The second one is Tavalisse, and this is the first example of a 6-tyrosine kinase inhibitor to reach the market, but the drug does also act on FLT3. Moving on to CNS. This year, 2018 was unusual in that we had a single novel mechanism of action, but 3 drugs for it, and those are the calcitonin gene-related peptide inhibitors, or CGRP inhibitors, for migraine prophylaxis. Now, this area is a little bit different because unlike a lot of the other first-in-class products, these do actually have a sizable market potential. There's many patients with migraine, and having 3 products each reach the market in quick succession in a field that has seen very little novelty for many years should make for an interesting marketing battle. Now, it's early days yet, and it remains to be seen which of these new drugs will come out on top. And there is more competition on its way from the pipeline. But Aimovig was the first to get onto the market, and it managed to generate $119 million in revenues following its launch in May 2018. It was swiftly followed by Ajovy and Emgality, and they were both launched in the second half of the year. So it's still too early to draw any serious conclusions about their 2018 uptake. Again, because of the marketing battle, there was a lot of free sampling involved to try and encourage patients onto the drugs. So we'll have to wait and see which one comes out top. Now we're going to look at a few other selected new drug approvals and launches that happened last year. These are the honourable mentions, that they're notable products, but they're not strictly novel, but we thought they were worth a mention. First of all, we have Texady, which and Onpattro. First of all, so Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, that had the first small interfering RNA or siRNA therapeutic, and that's Onpattro, and that was for the rare disease again, hereditary transthyretin-mediated amyloidosis. Now, the company thinks that this could address a target population of about 10 to 15,000 patients in the US. For the same indication, we got Axia's Texady, and that was another rare success for an antisense therapeutic. So both of those have different mechanisms of action. Next, we have GW's Epidiolex, and this hit the headlines for being the first cannabis-based product approved in the US, and that was for 2 rare types of epilepsy. And then finally, we have 3 drugs approved for rare cancers, and that's Zopatra, Lumoxiti, and Azedra. One of the interesting things that we saw in 2018 was that it broke a lot of records. One of those was that it was the US FDA's most productive year in terms of overall approvals. But a lot of these were for, we saw the industry going a lot deeper into rare diseases, particularly rare cancers. And around, I think it was nearly 60% of the FDA's approvals were for drugs that had an orphan indication. So it just shows where we're going with novelty in the industry. And then finally, for this section, we're going to take a look at which companies were the most successful in terms of novel drug launches last year. So this table lists the top companies by number of NAS launches and includes all the top 10 companies, plus any other firms that were involved in the introduction of more than one new drug. As you can see, we have Pfizer and Merck & Co tied at the top because they were the only companies that managed to deliver 4 new drugs to the market. Though we think Pfizer probably edges a win here because it developed 3 of its novel NASs by itself, and they were Durismo, Lobrina, and Visimpro, and they again were orphan cancers. It had one collaboration, and that was with Merck, and that was for the anti-diabetic Steglatro. By contrast, all of Merck's 4 launches were developed through collaborations. Next, we can see Eli Lilly, AstraZeneca, Novartis, and Sanofi, and they each launched 2 products. But there was a notable difference last year. Unlike 2017, not every top 10 company managed to launch, and GlaxoSmithKline there is notable for having no new launches. So now I'm going to hand back to Ian, who's going to take us through the current R&D pipeline in a lot more detail.
Thanks, Alex. So I think that's good news. We see a record-breaking year for the delivery of new drugs from the industry. So I think we can agree that the fact that the pipeline grew in size is a good thing. And now we're going to take a look into more detail into the pipeline and try and ascertain some trends within it. This first graph breaks down the pipeline by global stage of development. So in this graph, every drug is just counted once by its most advanced stage of development worldwide. And you can see reading left to right, we're going from preclinical through the clinical stages up to launched. One thing to mention at the start, because people always ask this if we don't explain it, is why phase 2 is higher than phase 1. Clearly, there are a number of drugs which die at phase 1. There's attrition between phase 1 and phase 2. So it would seem to not make sense that there are more drugs in phase 2. But actually, this is a reflection of the fact that this data is a snapshot. So even though more drugs go through phase 1, because phase 2 takes longer, they tend to pile up in phase 2. So that at any one time, there are more drugs in phase 2 than there are phase 1. So looking across the different phases, we can see the biggest rise occurred in the preclinical, with a 6% rise, up by 4,001 drugs added to the database in the previous 12 months. Percentage-wise, though, there were bigger increases at both phase 1, which was up 7.2%, and phase 2, up 9.2%. But you'll notice that phase 3 is flat, and actually the number of drugs in the pre-registration or the approved but not launched stages are actually down a bit. So let's look into this clinical section in a little more detail. And in this graph, we're looking back into history a little bit more, going back to 2007. And you can see that across all stages of clinical development, there have been notable increases year on year, really quite significant in that the number of drugs in phase 1 and 2 is pretty much double of what it was 12 years ago. But you will also notice in phase 3 that the effect where we've not seen an increase from 2018 to 2019 has really been something that's been building up in the last few years. You'll see it's been flat really for 3 years now, and there was only a small increase the year before. So I think this is interesting. Clearly the industry, as we've just seen, is being productive, but it certainly hasn't overcome one of its major barriers to producing new drugs, and that is the attrition at phase 2. So we're still seeing more drugs going through phase 1 and phase 2 and not going through to phase 3. So not really breaking through the pain barrier of phase 2. If we now look at the top 10 pharma companies by pipeline size, so you often see graphs by sales, but this table is by the number of drugs in each of the company's pipelines. And you can see that Novartis stays top with 219 drugs, up from 223 the year before, so pretty similar number. And of these, it originated 131. You also notice Takeda up at number 2. This is on the back of the recent acquisition of Shire, which completed in early January. And not surprisingly, this boosts Takeda up to the highest position we've ever seen a Japanese headquartered company get to. However, it is worth pointing out that the company has announced it expects to divest some products or consolidate as the merger beds down. So it's quite possible that the number in the combined Takeda-Shire pipeline will actually go down in the coming months. Another big merger which has been in the news recently is the Bristol-Myers Squibb and Celgene. So even though neither company is in the top 10, we actually worked out that by adding up their current pipelines, they would in fact be equal third with Johnson & Johnson. So only 2 other top 10 companies grew their pipeline size during the 12 months preceding 2019, and they were Sanofi and Lilly. And this is an interesting trend we've observed really over the last few years. What you see here is the percentage of the entire pipeline on the pink line, which the top 10 pharma companies contributed. And you can see that in 2011, the top 10 pharma companies were contributing 13% of all drugs in development. And this has been declining steadily and actually is now down to 6.45% in 2019. A similar trend can be observed if you look at the grey line, which is how many drugs the top 25 companies contributed. This is now at 11%, down from 18.3% in 2011. So what we're seeing is the so-called big pharma are actually providing a lower percentage of the pipeline than they were, despite considerable merger and acquisition activity. The purple line shows the number of percentage of drugs in the pipeline contributed to by the really small companies, the ones with just 1 or 2 drugs. There are in fact 2,302 companies which only have 1 or 2 drugs. So these obviously equate in many cases to startups. This is 53% of all of the companies, and they're actually providing greater than 19% of the pipeline. So this has increased a little bit since 2011 when it was around 15%, but it's flattened a bit. But basically what we're seeing is the big pharma companies are providing a smaller proportion of the pipeline, and we're seeing a longer and longer tail of small startup companies which are actually providing more biomass, if you like, for the pipeline. In terms of the total number of companies involved in pharma R&D, this is what's shown on this graph here, again running from 2001 up until 2019. The total number of companies providing drugs in pharma R&D was 4,323. This represented a 4.6% increase in the total number of companies, up from a 3.3% increase that we saw in the previous year. So in similar order to the figures we saw for the overall number of drugs in the pipeline. However, during 2018, we actually added 772 newly identified companies onto the database, slightly more than the 670 we added in 2017. But clearly, the total number of companies hasn't gone up by anywhere near as much. So this means that 533 companies must have exited pharma R&D during the year. And this could be through merger and acquisition, or it could be through failure, or in many cases, we find they just stop reporting information, the websites don't get updated, they're either in hibernation, or they're looking for more money, or maybe they've kind of quietly slipped away. So it's quite an interesting, what a rate of churn. Out of 4,300 odd companies, there's kind of churn of 533 in a single year. Moving away from companies now to slice the pipeline by therapeutic area. And what you can see here is the total number of drugs active in each therapeutic area. The 2018 figure is in purple, the 2019 in pink. And unlike in the previous graph of global status, drugs can get counted more than once here. So for drugs under development for an oncology indication and also for an alimentary indication, for example, it would get counted in each of those figures. You can see the anti-cancer or oncology figure is by far the largest, up by 9.3%. Next, you see not really a therapeutic area, but another kind of class of drugs, if you like, the biotechnology drugs. And these are up by a massive 14.1%. Then you start to hit the other therapeutic areas. So the runner-up main therapeutic area is neurologicals. That should have a rise of 6.6%. And if you remember, the total pipeline size that we're measuring this against was around 5.9% up. So this shows you both oncology, neurology, and also alimentary metabolic with a 7.6% increase, all outperforming. But not all therapeutic areas did outperform. Anti-infectives were only up by 1.4%. and musculoskeletal by 0.9%. So within that 5.9% overall, there's considerable variation by therapeutic area. So we've seen cancer really taking a bigger and bigger slice of the R&D pie year by year, and it's worth taking a moment to just really look at how this has changed, because I think this is really quite striking data. As recently as 2010, 1 in 4 pipeline drugs had an oncology indication, 26.8%. This year, it's 35.2%. So more than 1 in 3 of all drugs in development are being targeted for at least one cancer disease. That's really a case of an industry really focusing very, very heavily in one therapeutic area. And you have to ask whether this has been at the expense of maybe less fashionable therapeutic areas. Here's a really interesting story. Because we have data going back on Pharmaprojects right back to 1980 and a special set of trends data to 1995, we can actually look even further back. And a really interesting story, I think, this year is gene therapy. So Alex mentioned about Luxturna being the first in vivo gene therapy being launched last year. But you can see that gene therapy hasn't really mirrored these kind of steady increases that we've seen across the board from year over year. It's had a really checkered history. From 1995 to 2003, the number of drugs in development which were gene therapies showed a pretty steady increase. But then there were some quite famous setbacks in clinical trials in the early noughties, and actually the area went into sort of decline, which really lasted pretty much a decade or so. But then since 2014, it's shown a really meteoric increase. And it's worth pointing out that the part of this increase that we've seen in the latter years includes things like CAR-T and CRISPR, where there is an element of gene therapy involved. In CAR-T, it's ex vivo gene therapy, but these drugs are also classified with the gene therapy category. And on the pink line, you can see in our chart of the top 25 therapeutic categories where gene therapy sat in the previous 20 years. So it was at number 3 in 2002, and then it actually fell out of the top 25 in the mid-noughties, and it's actually returned to where it was in 2002 this year, back at number 3 in the charts. Zooming in a little bit further, we can look at the individual diseases or indications which drugs are in development for. And here's the top 10. You can see breast cancer at number 1 with 774 drugs in the pipeline, up from 727 in 2018. And this is up 6.5%. Non-small cell lung cancer is in second, with another big increase, up 7.7%. And in fact, cancers now account for 14 of the top 20 individual diseases for which drugs are in development. Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes are the only top non-cancer indications within the top 10. It's interesting to see Alzheimer's disease actually increasing both its number and its position, despite the fact that 2018, as in a number of previous years, saw some high-profile phase 3 failures. So it's proving a really, really tough nut to crack, but so far it doesn't look as if the industry is being put off investing in this area. Clearly, a successful drug in Alzheimer's would not only be great news for patients, would really be a blockbuster. If we look at the top diseases from 11 to 25, again, we see lots of cancer here. We also see rheumatoid arthritis and pain fall. So some of the non-cancer indications, their pipelines are actually shrinking, which goes some way to answering our question earlier on, who is suffering in response to the cancer taking more and more share of the R&D. Another interesting thing to notice here is we have a new entry in the top 25 at number 21 with non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH, a big climber. For the first time it's appeared in the top 25 and definitely one of the diseases of the moment. There's an increasing focus on rare diseases, so a number of rare diseases were again highlighted in Alex's review of the novel new active substances. What we can see here is the dark purple bar gives you the number of different rare diseases for which we see drugs in development year by year. So there were 389 diseases on the industry's radar in 2013, and this has risen to 580 by 2018, so fairly significant. And the actual number of drugs for rare diseases has risen from 4,615 in 2018 to nearly 5,000 now. So it really shows you out of a 16,000 pipeline, 5,000 drugs, 500 different rare diseases being looked at and 5,000 drugs. So not surprising there to see on the other bars, the number of orphan drug statuses being granted has generally increased over the years, and also the number of expedited review status designations, which again tend to be granted to rare diseases. Moving on to mechanisms of action, so how the drugs are actually working. So the classification system we use in Pharmaprojects is hierarchical. So we have kind of broader mechanisms at the top of the hierarchy, and then we go down to different levels. So it's probably not surprising that when we review the top 10 each year, the broad strategies tend to dominate. And this is really because quite often in drugs' early stages of development, we're not able to assign them a very specific mechanism, or it's not been disclosed, or in some cases it's not been discovered. But we also have a number of general mechanisms to facilitate easy searching. And one of these is immuno-oncology. And this year, immuno-oncology has overturned the other broad category, immunostimulant, to take the summit for the very first time, the most popular strategy. I think what's interesting to really note here, if you look at the final column to the right, you'll see a percentage of drugs with each mechanism which are either in the pre-registration phase or registered or launched. And only 1.6% of the nearly 2,000 immuno-oncology drugs have currently reached these later stages. And in fact, only 24 drugs have hit the market. So this shows that despite this being a huge area where the industry is really focusing, actually in many senses it's still unproven. And also just note that increase from year on year, from 1875 up from 1332. You also see the T-cell stimulant category showing a big increase, with 404 up to 106. And this is one of the categories that's assigned to the aforementioned CAR T therapies and also to some kinds of vaccines. So let's take a moment to reflect on the meteoric rise of immuno-oncology. So these are the drugs where they're being administered to actually train the body's own immune system to fight cancer rather than being directly anti-cancer. So it's so new that in 2015, when we wrote our report, we hadn't even created a category for it. By 2016, there were already 400 drugs, 2017, nearly 900, and well, I think the graph speaks for itself. The rise has really been meteoric, so the industry is clearly extremely excited about immuno-oncology. It's still, as I said, in some senses relatively unproven, but it looks like, particularly used in combination, this is going to be a real meteoric step forward for cancer sufferers. Looking at the top 10 drug protein targets, so here we're not looking at the actual mechanism of action in the pharmacological sense, we're looking at the individual drug protein in the body which a drug targets. Slightly different story here. We see the mu1 opioid receptor at the top of the chart, as it has been for a number of years. And this is a target involved in either pain or constipation, depending on whether it's an agonist or an antagonist drug. Actually, you see only 2 cancer targets in the top 10. At number 2 and number 3. You see 2 diabetes, one's at 8 and 9. So the fact that there are fewer cancer targets in the top 10, I think really is an indication of just how many different cancer targets there are these days. Such a lot has been worked out in terms of disease pathways for cancer that there is a really, really broad spread of different cancer targets. This is why they're not cropping up in the top 10 just yet. Interestingly, for immuno-oncology, the actual individual targets in immuno-oncology are actually starting to knock at the door of the top 10, with CD19 currently at number 11, PD1 at number 12, and CD274, which is also known as PDL1, at number 14. Here we take a look at the number of newly identified drug protein targets each year. So this is the first time we find a drug which is hitting a brand new target. So it's a really good indication of how innovation is going in the industry. And you can see that 97 new targets were identified in 2018. And actually, if you look at the figures over the previous 15 years or so, that's about bang on the mean. So it's a pretty average year in terms of innovation. Certainly wasn't a bad year, and it was better than 2017. The total number of targets against which drugs are currently being actively developed, which is another good indication of how innovative the industry is being, rose from 1,657 to 1,706. What about this switch towards biologicals? So this has been another trend that's been going on for some time here. So here what we've done is we've split the entire pipeline between what you might call traditional drugs, the usual small molecule kinds of drugs, and then the newer biological kinds of drugs. So recombinant proteins, monoclonal antibodies, the RNA therapies that Alex mentioned earlier, all those kinds of things. And you can see in 1995 that biologicals only accounted for around 16% of the pipeline. And there's been a steady increase, probably a little bit flatter during the noughties, but in the past few years, again, it's gone up again. And now we're talking about 39.7% of all drugs in R&D being biologicals, up from 37.9% the year before. And if you take a moment to think about the fact that these drugs are intrinsically less pleasant for patients to take because they tend to be injectable, it really does indicate that they must be particularly good drugs. They have really, really firm targets. So the fact that the industry is going for these kinds of drugs just really shows the advantages of them. So that's a quick review of the pipeline as it stands now. So let's take a moment to look ahead for 2019, and Alex is going to take you through what we expect to happen in the next few months.
Thanks, Ian. So now we're going to take a look at what we can expect to see, first of all, in terms of new drug launches this year. And that means looking back at what got approved for the first time late 2018 and what has been approved so far in 2019. So first of all, we have Ultomiris. This is a next generation successor to Alexion's aging blockbuster Soliris. It's actually already been launched. It was launched in January for paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. It's a longer acting complement inhibitor, and the product has actually also shown promise at phase 3 for patients with atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. Another product that's already reached the market following a late 2018 approval was Elzonris, and that was launched in January by Stemline Therapeutics for a rare cancer after it got a breakthrough therapy designation from the US FDA. They've also managed to bag an accelerated assessment in the EU for the product, so that means it's going to be reviewed in 150 days, so quite substantially less than a standard review at the EMA. Next, we have China. China has approved a novel PD-1 inhibitor from Innovent Biologics. That happened at the turn of the year and was for Hodgkin's disease. It happened ahead of expectations again, which is showing something of the speed by which some of these novel therapies are coming through the regulatory system. This product is actually Tyvyt. It's also being developed in collaboration with Eli Lilly for Western markets, and including indications such as lung cancer. And then another product that has hit the headlines so far this year is J&J's nasal spray for depression, esketamine. This had breakthrough status, and it breezed through its advisory panel meeting in February, getting a strong vote in favour of approval. And this came despite the fact that it had mixed efficacy and some potential safety issues. The product's now been launched under the trade name Spravato, and J&J has just said in its first quarter earnings call that the controlled product is now already being administered through 800 certified sites in the US, and that's just 6 weeks after launch. So that seems to have got off to a good start for J&J. Moving on to approvals that we expect to see coming this year. This is the first of a couple of slides. The first of these is tenapanor, which is a new approach to constipation-predominant IBS, and this is from Ardelyx. The product is the sodium-hydrogen exchange inhibitor and has a user fee date in September. What's interesting for this product is that it's hopefully approaching the market just as the US FDA has given the green light to get an old product back on the market, and that was Zalnorm or Ticacerod. That was first launched in the noughties when there was an awful lot of activity in the IBS area, but then it was pulled from the US in 2007 by Novartis, its originator, because of some cardiovascular risks that came to light. However, the US FDA now says it can return under a new label which restricts its use to women at low cardiovascular risk, and that happened at a panel last month under a new sponsor, Sloan Pharma. So it sounds like the IBS area is going to be becoming a lot more active. Next, we have selinexor, and that's from Carrier Pharm. This is for multiple myeloma. It's a novel drug, so it inhibits the nuclear export protein, or EXPO1. When EXPO1 is inhibited, what happens is tumor suppressive proteins accumulate in the cell nucleus, and that leads to the induction of apoptosis. The product has been filed in the US and the EU. However, its PDUFA date was pushed back from the 6th of April to the 6th of July after the FDA's ODAC committee requested more data. Another thing is that the multiple myeloma field is increasingly competitive, so it's really going to have to muscle its way into the market there, but a first-in-class label should help. Next, we have givosiran. This is another RNAi therapeutic approaching the market again from Alnylam. It's targeting aminolelynate synthase for porphyria. And then finally on the slide we have lefamulin. This hopefully will be a welcome addition to the antibiotic arsenal. It was filed late last year in the US and an EU filing is due. Next, we're going on to part 2, which is important approvals expected this year, which are biologicals. The first 2 of these are both from Novartis. The first which is brolucizumab, and this is a new option for wet age-related macular degeneration. And hopefully it will come to the market with a 12-week dosing label. Less frequent dosing is definitely where this field is moving. Rival product Eylea already has a 12-week label in the US, and there are many therapies already entrenched. Novartis, however, has managed to secure a priority FDA review for brolucizumab. It's done that by using a priority review voucher, and that should speed its way through the regulators. If it does get to market, it could be a good global opportunity for Novartis. Novartis does sell Lucentis outside the US, but this should add to its franchise. The second product is another interesting one. This is Zolgensma, and hopefully this will be a one-time gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. Novartis got hold of Zolgensma when it bought Avexis, its originator, for $8.7 billion last year. Now, this product is hopefully due to get a decision from the US FDA next month, again after a priority review. As I said, it's hopefully a one-time gene therapy. It will go up against Biogen's Spinraza, and that was the first ever treatment for this fatal genetic condition. SMA is actually the leading cause of infant mortality, leading genetic cause of infant mortality. And Spinraza was a splicing inhibitor, so different from the gene therapy. But there is also competition. Roche also has a product that's similar to Spinraza, also a splicing inhibitor in late stage development, and that's called Risdiplam. So it is setting up to be an interesting marketing battle. There are different stages of this disease, and how the market will be sliced up will be very interesting to see. And I think a lot of it will depend on how long-lasting the effects of Zolgensma are. Novartis just this morning has reported updated clinical data for the product that's it's pivotal data, so it should be interesting to see that. Next, we have another gene therapy, and this one's from Bluebird, and it's Zynteglo. This is for transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia, and the product's just been given a positive opinion from the EU CHMP, so hopefully should get its rubber stamping fairly shortly. It hasn't yet been filed in the US, though. That's expected later this year. And the company has also already suggested an instalment payment plan for the product, because one of the major issues for these hopefully one-time gene therapies will be their high upfront cost and how that can be spread out so as to reduce the burden on payers. Yeah, this is a common thing. A lot of the gene therapy companies are suggesting these types of payment plans. Most recently was, I think, Roche this morning, talking about the Roche CEO, was talking about these kind of payment plans for gene therapies. As we know, Roche has just bought Spark, I think it's Spark. So this is a real theme that's going on in the industry at the moment. And Spark last year with Alexandra was one of the first to sort of propose this kind of payment plan for these products. Finally on the slide we have Celgene's Lysocell, and that's for diffuse B-cell lymphoma. However, this is a little bit further off. Filing's not actually due until the second half. Celgene got this gene therapy, this CAR-T therapy, when it acquired Juno, and then this product has become one of, when BMS decided it wanted to buy Celgene, it highlighted this product as one of the late-stage assets, you know, that made it want to buy the company. So it's quite an important product for BMS. The BMS Celgene deal has just been backed by shareholders from both companies, and Lysocell has PRIME designation in the EU and breakthrough therapy status again. So hopefully it should go through the regulators quite quickly. Now, just to close off the presentation, we're going to look at a few of the other wider issues that we think are likely to affect pharma in 2019. These are the macro, we're looking at the macro level here. First of these, obviously, continued political upheaval, particularly the uncertainty around Brexit. Obviously, the UK has had a bit of a reprieve. There's no immediate threat of a no deal after the extension for Article 50. However, we still don't know what's going to happen, and companies are still, you know, there is still the possibility of leaving without a deal, and companies are going to need to keep their contingency plans in place. Moving to earlier this year, obviously, there was the US government shutdown. That slowed things down a bit at the FDA, but we'll have to see what kind of knock-on effect that will have more long-term for this year. Next, looking at the M&A picture. Obviously, last year there was predicted to be an M&A boom following the tax changes, but that kind of failed to materialise. However, this year we've seen a lot more activity. Obviously, most notably is the BMS purchase of Celgene, which it did in an effort to diversify away from its top product of Devo and to broaden out. However, there are a lot of smaller but still notable deals going on. Roche, as we mentioned before, has just bought Spark to boost its gene therapy franchise, and it bought it for, well, it's buying it hopefully for 4.8 billion, which was a lot less than Novartis paid for Avexis. As you remember, Novartis shelled out about 8.7 billion for Avexis. But it wasn't the only gene therapy M&A deal. We've also had Sarepta buying Myonexus as well. So clearly gene therapy is a hot topic, not just for pricing and reimbursement, but also for M&A. So pricing and reimbursement are always a perennial topic for the industry. There's a lot of debate about rebates, of course, in the US at the moment, and we don't see that going anywhere anytime soon. And then finally, just looking at what therapeutic advances we expect to see this year. First of all, we've got the new approaches. Clearly, gene therapy is a big theme, but it's not the only one. There's still a lot of work going on around the microbiome and new genomic testing. Genomic testing obviously is going to become more important with more personalized medicine and also with the gene therapies as well. Again, oncology, as we've seen, it dominates the pipeline and it dominates a lot of the news that comes out, and there's bound to be a lot of activity here. These are some of the particular areas that we think are going to be busy, looking at new IO combinations, also looking at disease that's become resistant to first-line therapies, as well as more tumor-agnostic therapies as well coming through. And finally, CNS is another area. There's already been a lot of activity, particularly in Alzheimer's so far. Biogen and Eisai recently announced that they're going to discontinue 2 phase 3 trials of their most advanced candidate, which is the aducanumab. But that was for patients with mild cognitive impairment, and they are continuing to test the anti-amyloid agents So there is still more activity going on there, but obviously nothing that's provided the breakthrough that we would like to see just yet. So now I'm going to hand over to Ian.
Thanks, Alex. So just to summarise the results of our survey this year, the R&D pipeline continues to grow at a healthy rate. And this might, in fact, be sustainable because we've seen really in the last few years a healthy number of new drugs actually making all the way onto the market. So this is a good thing. However, the phase 2 failure rate remains a barrier, and there really hasn't been much progress in the last few years in solving the issues of drugs getting through the phase 2 barrier. Limited big M&A is underway, but despite this, and despite the fact that the top 10 companies are acquiring lots of small companies like the gene therapy companies Alex was just mentioning, the top companies are actually losing share in terms of their share of the overall pipeline. In therapeutics, cancer is becoming ever more dominant, and in particular, immuno-oncology has really come from nowhere to become the most popular strategy for all drug development. So finally, to use a sporting metaphor to end our presentation, particularly with a nod to the forthcoming Rugby World Cup, which is taking place in Japan later this year, I think we can say that in 2018, Pharma scored a try, and now it needs to get a conversion. So with that, we'd like to thank you for your attention. We just have time for a couple of questions. So looking through what we have here. So one, I think, for you, Alex, we've talked a lot through the presentation about drugs for rare diseases, particularly in your new active substance launches. What effect is this having on the industry, given that most of these drugs are for very small numbers of patients?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because, I mean, as I said, I think the FDA, nearly 60% of the drugs approved by the FDA last year, which was its most record year, were for orphan indications. And as we said, Pfizer's 4 anti-cancer launches last year were again for niche indications. So what we've had are more products reaching the market, but for smaller indications. So in terms of sales, it's difficult to say at the moment because of the pricing and reimbursement. And I think we might have to wait and see what kind of impact that's going to have. I mean, what was interesting, I thought, was Biotech, which has had a lot of news kind of reports this year, a lot of attention in the last year. That's a good case in point because the tumour agnostic thing, but it's not expected to become a blockbuster, and Bayer's been quite open about that. I mean, the upshot it's good for developers in that you can get to, if you've got a niche indication, you can get to market quicker, you can do smaller clinical trials, you can get through the regulators more quickly. But on the flip side, you're not going to get the patient populations that, the major blockbusters had in days gone by. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And again, gene therapies, one-time products, massive prices. How are we going to pay for those, and what is actually going to be the return on investment for companies? We'll have to wait and see. All right, let's have a look. Another question. I think that could be for you, Ian. What evidence is there of the rise of innovative R&D in China, and is it starting to challenge the traditional Western markets?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing we've definitely been observing over the past few years. So probably 10 or 20 years ago, most of the Chinese pharmaceutical industry was based around generics and other kinds of copy products. But we've just seen more and more native Chinese pharmaceutical companies kind of actually producing innovative new drugs. And one way we can look at this is we can look at the percentage of companies which are headquartered in each country worldwide. So I think it's probably no surprise that the US is still hugely dominant. 46% of all companies involved in pharma R&D are based in the USA. But this is actually down 2% from last year, so it's slightly slipping away, stranglehold there. And the most interesting thing is the second most common country for a pharma company to be based in is now China. That's the first time that's reached number 2, has 301 native pharma R&D companies there, or 7% of the companies involved in pharma R&D. So we've really seen that come up again from nowhere in the last few years, so definitely something to watch. I see we're almost on the hour now, so apologies if we didn't get to your question. If you did send a question in, we will certainly get back to you in the next few days, maybe after the Easter break that we have here in the UK, so please bear with us. I'd also like to remind you once again that the Pharma R&D report is a free download available on our website. The new active substance report will be following up pretty soon, and the slides and the recording of the presentation will also be available to you. So with that, we thank you very much for your attention and look forward to talking to you again in 2020. Goodbye.
Goodbye.